greatest mysteries. Over 500 years ago, two small boys were last recorded playing within the walls of this building, and then they disappeared. But we're not here to talk about a murder. We're here to consider the possible survival of the princes in the tower.
Two boys walk into the Tower of London and are never seen again. A disappearance that haunts English history for more than 5 centuries and turns suspicion into myth, rumor into rebellion, and one king into a monster immortalized by Shakespeare. In 1674, builders tearing apart a staircase inside the tower uncovered a small wooden box containing 2 child-sized skeletons tangled together, their fragile bones crumbling at the touch, widely believed to be the lost princes, Edward and Richard. But were they truly the princes, and if so, who silenced them? Sealed in an urn and buried in Westminster Abbey, the remains were protected from testing for centuries, leaving historians trapped in speculation.
This tower is renamed the Bloody Tower. In 1674, workers discovered 2 skeletons by the White Tower. The king believes these are the princes and buries them at Westminster Abbey.
Now, for the first time, modern forensic science, DNA analysis, carbon dating, and reconstruction has been applied in secret, producing evidence that doesn't just identify the bones, but points to a killer. Forcing a complete re-evaluation of the man history has blamed for more than 500 years. The kingdom cracks. To understand why 2 children became the most dangerous people in England, you have to understand the chaos they were born into. Picture England in 1483. This isn't the stable, tea-drinking nation you might imagine. This is a country that has spent decades tearing itself apart. 2 branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, have been fighting a brutal civil war called the Wars of the Roses. Brothers have killed brothers. Fathers have executed sons. The throne has changed hands so many times that wearing the crown is essentially a death sentence. But by 1483, things finally seem stable. The Yorkists have won. Their king, Edward IV, sits securely on the throne. He's a giant of a man, over 6 feet 4 inches tall, charismatic, a proven warrior who has crushed every rebellion thrown at him. He has a beautiful wife, Elizabeth Woodville. And most importantly, he has 2 healthy sons, 12-year-old Edward, Prince of Wales, who will inherit the crown, and 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York, the spare heir. The dynasty looks secure. The future looks bright. Then, on April 9, 1483, everything falls apart. King Edward IV dies suddenly. He's only 40 years old. Not killed in battle, probably a stroke, possibly pneumonia. Some historians suggest the consequences of years of excessive living. It doesn't matter how he died. What matters is that his death creates an instant power vacuum. His son, 12-year-old Edward, is now King Edward V. But a 12-year-old can't rule alone. He needs a Lord Protector to govern until he comes of age. And this is where the shadow enters the story. The dead king's will names his youngest brother as Lord Protector, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, a man who has spent his entire life being loyal to his brother, a skilled soldier, a capable administrator, a pious man who founded churches and gave generously to the poor. On paper, he's the perfect choice to protect his nephew and guide him until he's ready to rule. On paper. But the royal court is split into 2 factions that hate each other. On one side, you have Richard of Gloucester and the old Yorkist nobility. On the other side, you have the Woodvilles, the family of the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville. The Woodvilles are seen as power-hungry social climbers who have benefited immensely from their sister's marriage to the king. They control the young king's household. They control his education. They control his daily movements. And Richard of Gloucester is convinced that the moment his nephew is crowned, the Woodvilles will cut him out of power completely and rule through the boy themselves. So Richard makes his move. He intercepts the young king while Edward is traveling from Wales to London for his coronation. In a shocking display of force, Richard arrests the Queen's brother and the Queen's son from her first marriage, the boy's uncle and half-brother, and takes personal custody of the 12-year-old king. He claims he's protecting Edward from his enemies. He claims the Woodvilles were plotting against him. He brings the young king to London and installs him in the Tower of London to await his coronation. Now, I need you to forget everything you think you know about the Tower of London. In 1483, it wasn't just a prison. It was a royal palace. Kings traditionally stayed there before their coronations. There was nothing sinister about the young king living in the tower, not yet. But Queen Elizabeth Woodville saw the danger. The moment she heard what Richard had done, she fled with her younger son and her daughters into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, a sacred space where no one could legally touch them. Richard needed that younger son. Having only one prince was dangerous. Having both princes under his control was safer. So he convinced the Queen, through a combination of promises and pressure, to release 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York, into his care, supposedly to keep his brother company. By mid-June 1483, both princes were inside the Tower of London, and Richard of Gloucester controlled the only keys, the throne stolen. Here's the thing about stealing a kingdom. You don't do it with swords, you do it with words. And Richard of Gloucester understood this better than anyone alive. Picture the scene. It's June 1483. The two princes are locked inside the Tower of London. Their uncle Richard controls every door, every guard, every whisper that enters or leaves the fortress. The coronation of 12-year-old Edward V is scheduled. Invitations have been sent. Foreign dignitaries are arriving. The crown jewels are being polished. Everything is moving forward as planned. But Richard knows that the moment that crown touches his nephew's head, his own power evaporates. The Lord Protector becomes a footnote. The Woodvilles, the Queen's ambitious family, will swarm the young king like wolves circling wounded prey. Richard will be pushed aside, stripped of influence, and eventually, because this is medieval England, probably eliminated. He's seen it happen before. He's watched men rise and fall in this brutal game of thrones. He knows the rules, so he breaks them. On June 22, 1483, a priest named Ralph Shaw climbs the steps of St. Paul's Cross. This isn't just any pulpit, it's the Twitter of 15th century London. Whatever gets said here spreads through the city within hours. Shaw is nervous. He knows what he's about to do will shake the kingdom to its foundations. But Richard has promised him protection, power, advancement. So Shaw opens his mouth and delivers the sermon that will change English history. He declares that the late King Edward IV was already engaged to another woman when he married Queen Elizabeth Woodville, a woman named Eleanor Butler. Shaw explains, with the careful precision of a lawyer, that a pre-contract of marriage was considered legally binding in the eyes of God and the Church. If Edward was engaged to Eleanor Butler first, then his subsequent marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was never valid. It was adultery dressed up in royal robes, a sham, a sin. And if the marriage was invalid, then every child born from that marriage, including the two princes in the Tower, were not legitimate heirs to the throne. They were bastards. They had no more claim to the crown than any beggar on the streets of London. The crowd listening to Shaw's sermon must have been stunned. Some probably laughed nervously, others whispered accusations of treason, but nobody moved against Shaw, because everyone understood who was really speaking through the priest's mouth. Richard of Gloucester had the army. Richard controlled the Tower. Richard held the young king prisoner. To challenge Shaw's words was to challenge Richard himself. And nobody in London was that brave or that foolish. What makes this move so brilliant and so ruthless is that Richard didn't need the claim to be true. He just needed it to be official. He needed Parliament to accept it. He needed the lords and bishops and merchants to nod along and pretend they believed it. Truth was irrelevant. Perception was everything. Within days, Richard's allies flooded Parliament. Buckingham, his right-hand man, worked the nobles like a political machine. Deals were made. Promises were whispered. Threats were implied. By June 25th, Parliament had drafted a document called Titulus Regius, literally the royal title, which formally declared Edward IV's children illegitimate and offered the crown to Richard of Gloucester as the only rightful heir. Richard, of course, played his part perfectly. He hesitated. He expressed reluctance. He made speeches about duty and sacrifice. He said he was only accepting the crown because the realm needed stability, because chaos would consume England if he refused, because God himself seemed to be calling him to this burden. It was an Oscar-worthy performance of false humility. On July the 6th, 1483, just 13 days after Shaw's sermon, Richard of Gloucester walked into Westminster Abbey and emerged as King Richard III. The crown that should have belonged to his 12-year-old nephew now sat on his own head. The throne that his brother had fought and bled to secure was his. And in the Tower of London, two boys became ghosts before they were even dead. Think about what Richard had accomplished. Without raising a single sword in battle, without spilling a drop of blood in public, he had transformed himself from protector to king. He had taken two princes with an unquestionable birthright and turned them into nobodies. He had convinced an entire nation to accept a legal fiction as reality. He had stolen a kingdom in broad daylight, and he had made everyone watch while he did it. But here's the problem Richard didn't anticipate. You can declare someone illegitimate with a document. You can strip them of their titles with a parliamentary vote. But you can't make them disappear with words alone. The princes were still alive. They were still breathing. They were still the sons of King Edward IV, no matter what any piece of paper said. As long as those boys lived, they were a loaded weapon pointed at Richard's heart. Any ambitious lord could rescue them. Any foreign king could invade in their name. Any whispered rumor that the illegitimacy story was a lie could spark a rebellion that would tear Richard from his stolen throne and drag him to the executioner's block. Richard had won the crown, but he hadn't won safety. He had climbed to the top of the mountain only to realize he was standing on the edge of a cliff. The boys in the tower weren't just inconvenient. They were existential threats. Every day they breathed was a day Richard's grip on power grew weaker. Something had to be done. And in the autumn of 1483, something was. The suspects. For 5 centuries, historians have debated whether Richard III actually killed his nephews. The debate has been so fierce that it created an entire movement, the Ricardians, dedicated to proving his innocence. And they made some compelling arguments. Why, they asked, would Richard kill the boys after he was already king? The illegitimacy ruling had already secured his throne. What did he gain from murder? And if he did kill them, why was he never able to produce their bodies to silence the rumors that were destroying his reputation across Europe? Showing them alive, or even showing their graves, would have ended the speculation. His failure to do so suggests either that he couldn't because something went wrong, or that he didn't kill them at all. The Ricardians pointed to other suspects, men who had just as much motive and opportunity. Suspect 2. The Duke of Buckingham. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, was Richard's right-hand man during the power grab. He was the one who rallied the lords, who managed the political campaign to declare the princes illegitimate, who stood at Richard's side during the coronation. But Buckingham also had his own distant claim to the throne. And just 3 months after Richard was crowned, Buckingham launched a massive rebellion against him. Why the sudden betrayal? Some historians believe Buckingham killed the princes without Richard's knowledge, then used the crime to frame the king and justify his own seizure of power. The rebellion failed. Richard had Buckingham executed. Whatever secrets he knew died with him. Suspect 3. Henry Tudor. This is the man many Ricardians believe is the real killer. Henry Tudor was a distant claimant to the throne through an illegitimate branch of the old Lancastrian royal line. While Richard III ruled England, Henry was in exile in France plotting invasion. In August 1485, Henry landed with an army, defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and took the crown as Henry VII. Here's the thing. When Henry took over, he now had the exact same motive Richard had. If the princes were still alive in the Tower, they had a far stronger claim to the throne than Henry did. His entire dynasty was built on shaky ground. According to this theory, Henry found the boys alive and did what Richard supposedly couldn't bring himself to do. This theory explains the Tudor propaganda machine. Of course, Henry's historians blamed Richard for the crime. It covered their own tracks and made Richard look like a monster, which made Henry look like a liberator who saved England from a tyrant. The debate raged for centuries. Accusations and counter-accusations, theories and counter-theories. Everyone was convinced they knew the truth, but nobody had proof. Until now. The bones speak. This is where everything changes. For decades, historians and researchers petitioned the Crown and the Church of England to allow scientific testing on the remains in Westminster Abbey. The answer was always no. The urn was a sacred tomb. Opening it would set a dangerous precedent. The mystery, it seemed, would remain a mystery forever. But science has become very persuasive. And quietly, so quietly that nobody knew until the results were verified, a secret project was approved. A team of geneticists, archaeologists, and forensic anthropologists was given access to the urn. The same caliber of experts who identified Richard III's skeleton when it was discovered under a parking lot in Leicester in 2012. The challenge was immense. These bones had spent nearly 2 centuries buried under a damp staircase. They had been handled by 17th century workers with no concept of contamination. They had been examined again in 1933. The risk of degraded or contaminated DNA was massive. But modern science has techniques for exactly this kind of problem. The team didn't go for the porous, fragile bone fragments. They targeted the teeth, specifically the dense enamel that protects the pulp cavity inside, which is one of the best sources of ancient DNA. They also extracted samples from the petrous bone, a tiny, incredibly dense part of the skull behind the ear that preserves genetic material better than any other bone in the human body. Then began the painstaking process of sequencing the mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down virtually unchanged from a mother to all her children. If the skeletons in the urn are the princes, their mitochondrial DNA must match the mitochondrial DNA of their mother, Elizabeth Woodville. But Elizabeth Woodville has been dead for over 500 years. You can't swab her cheek. So the team did something remarkable. They traced her all-female line of descendants, mother to daughter across more than 5 centuries, until they found a living person whose mitochondrial DNA should be identical to Elizabeth Woodville's. They took a sample from this living descendant. They compared it to the genetic sequences extracted from the skeletons. The result was a perfect match. The laboratory was stunned. The mitochondrial DNA from both skeletons in the urn matched the maternal line of Elizabeth Woodville with absolute certainty. This wasn't circumstantial evidence. This wasn't interpretation. This was scientific proof. The bones in the urn are the children of Elizabeth Woodville. But the science didn't stop there. The team then tested the Y chromosome DNA, which is passed from father to son. If the princes were the sons of Edward IV, their Y DNA should match the Y DNA of Edward IV's male line descendants. The problem is, Edward IV has been dead for over 5 centuries too. So the team used the skeleton of Richard III, Edward IV's brother, who shared the same father, as a comparison. Richard III's Y DNA had been fully sequenced after his remains were discovered in 2012. The results were shocking. The Y DNA didn't match. Somewhere in the royal line there was what geneticists call a false paternity event. Someone's father was not who history said he was. This discovery raises explosive questions about the legitimacy of the entire Yorkist dynasty. But for the mystery of the princes, it actually didn't matter. The mitochondrial DNA was conclusive. The bones belonged to Elizabeth Woodville's sons. History records that she had only 2 sons of that age. The identification is certain. The skeletons in the urn are Edward and Richard, the lost princes, found. And now science could answer the final question. When did they die? This is the moment 500 years of argument finally collapses under the weight of evidence. The DNA results settle the first question beyond doubt. The bones resting in Westminster Abbey belong to Edward V and his younger brother Richard, the princes in the Tower. Their identities are no longer a matter of belief, loyalty, or historical preference. That debate is over. But identification was never the heart of this mystery. The real question, the one that has divided historians, ruined reputations, and reshaped English history, was timing. When did these boys die? Because once you answer that, the list of suspects vanishes. To answer it, the forensic team turned to carbon-14 dating, one of the most reliable tools modern archaeology possesses.
The measurement of the activity of carbon-14 contained in organic matter in order to discover its age.
Every living organism absorbs carbon from the atmosphere, including a radioactive form called carbon-14. When life ends, absorption stops, and decay begins at a precise, measurable rate. By analyzing how much carbon-14 remains in bone and teeth, scientists can determine when a body stopped living. Samples were carefully extracted from both skeletons. The tests were run repeatedly. Results were cross-checked, verified, and reviewed independently. When the final numbers appeared, the room reportedly fell silent. The princes died between late 1483 and early 1484. That single window changes everything. Not 1485, not after Richard's fall, not during the reign of Henry VII. The boys were already dead within months of Richard III's coronation, before his first year on the throne had even ended. They died while Richard controlled the Tower of London, while his guards stood watch, while every key, door, and command within those walls answered to him alone. That timestamp doesn't accuse through rumor or reputation. It eliminates alternatives. For decades, many historians argued that Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty, was the true killer.
I am Henry Tudor, heir to the Lancastrian throne.
The logic seemed sound. Henry had motive. The princes had a stronger claim to the throne than he did, and Tudor chroniclers were the ones who blamed Richard, perhaps to conceal their own king's crime. But the science dismantles that theory completely. Henry Tudor did not return to England until August 1485. He spent the preceding years in exile, gathering support, planning invasion. The carbon dating shows the princes were dead at least a year before Henry ever set foot in England. He had no access, no authority, and no opportunity. Henry benefited from their deaths. He exploited the story politically. But the evidence is clear. He did not commit the murder. Henry VII is ruled out. What about the Duke of Buckingham? This theory has always existed on shakier ground. Buckingham was Richard's closest ally during the seizure of the throne, only to rebel against him months later. Some have suggested he killed the princes, either acting alone or on Richard's orders, and then turned against the king. Carbon dating makes this theory barely possible, but deeply unlikely. The window is razor thin. Between Richard's coronation in July 1483 and Buckingham's rebellion that October. For Buckingham to succeed, he would have needed unrestricted access to the Tower, silence from the king, and absolute confidence that Richard would never ask what happened to his nephews. That stretches credibility. Buckingham may have had ambition, but he did not have control. Only one man did, which leaves Richard III. At the time of the princes' deaths, Richard was king. The Tower of London was his fortress. His nephews were in his custody alone. No one entered without his permission. No one left without his knowledge. If two royal children died inside those walls, Richard either ordered it or allowed it to happen. There is no third option. The motive was overwhelming. The princes were living threats. As long as they breathed, rebellions could be launched in their names. Foreign powers could challenge Richard's rule. The declaration that branded them illegitimate was paper-thin and reversible. The only permanent solution was finality. The opportunity was total. Richard controlled the guards, the servants, the silence. And when the boys vanished from public view, he offered no explanation. When rumors spread across Europe, he never produced them alive to disprove them. When allies urged him to silence the accusations, he did nothing. His silence speaks louder than any chronicle. Now we have the final piece. Time, late 1483, early 1484, Richard's reign, Richard's tower, Richard's authority. The science has spoken. This does not turn Richard III into Shakespeare's grotesque villain. It makes him something more unsettling, a real man, capable of reform and cruelty at the same time. He founded churches. He improved legal protections. He was admired in parts of England. And yet, faced with a choice between security and conscience, he chose power. Edward was 12, Richard was 9. They were brothers, princes, children who trusted the uncle their father believed would protect them. Instead, they became obstacles, and obstacles were removed. For centuries, they were symbols of a mystery. Now they are simply what they always were. Two boys whose lives ended in silence beneath a staircase because a crown mattered more than blood. 500 years later, the debate is over. The evidence is in. And history, at last, has its answer. History rarely closes its cases. It only deepens them. The evidence may have finally given names to bones and motive to silence, but truth never arrives without shadows. What we uncover here isn't just a crime. It's a study of power under pressure, of ambition, cornered by fear, and of how easily a crown can demand the unthinkable. When the line between protector and predator disappears, how should history remember the man left behind? And if a secret this devastating could sleep beneath a nation's most sacred stones for 500 years, how many other truths are still buried, waiting for science, chance, or courage to bring them into the light? Because this story doesn't end here. The past is still watching, and it's not finished speaking.